Let's see how we sometimes diverge away from the market equilibrium. A common myth is that limiting the price of necessities will make them more available to the consumers. Use what you've learned in the course so far to formulate some argument or example against this myth. So pause here and write at least 3-4 lines, it could be in bullet form, to respond to this myth. Did you see that? It was crushed. The opposite of a flexible price is a price control, which is when the government imposes a restriction on the price of something, top down. And it comes in two forms, price ceiling and price floor. Now that should be quite intuitive. A ceiling is above your head, it's an upper bound. The floor is a lower limit, you can't go below. Now what do you think is the logic for having a price ceiling? Remember, a high price is good for the sellers, bad for the buyers. So setting an upper limit is meant to help the buyers not be abused, and it would be applied to essentials. What about price floor? What is the purpose for it? That is used when the sellers are deemed to be weak, in a disadvantaged position, and without bargaining power. And the best example for it is the minimum wage, which is the price of labor, and the sellers of labor are the workers. Now watch out, these are only the proclaimed objectives, not the actual results. It's not enough to have good intentions. As an economist, you must be sensitive about how they're executed and their consequences. Sometimes the road to hell is good intentions, right? So take notes and write your own example of something that would deserve a price ceiling in your opinion, and something that may deserve a price floor in your opinion. I really want you to understand the logic behind price controls. Imagine a pharmaceutical drug, and initially, without any government restriction, the market price is 100. Basically, the price can go as high or as low as it may, depending on the willingness to pay of buyers and the cost of the sellers, depending on its scarcity. The government then comes in and says, hang on, this is a matter of life and death. Everyone must have access to it. So they set a price ceiling, an upper limit on the price. So the price will drop. But this is not due to market forces, it's artificially imposed by the government. Now, what does the law of demand tell you? When the price falls, what happens to the number of buyers? And what does the law of supply tell you? What happens to the number of sellers? So, that's cool. We can predict that there's going to be more buyers and fewer sellers. And what is that called? When there are a lot of buyers, not enough sellers, it's called a shortage, right? So the sellers will lose the incentive to offer at this price. Notice that the policy had noble objectives, but it defeats its purpose. It was meant for everyone to have access to the drug, but we get lower production because we didn't anticipate and we didn't respect the incentives of rational decision makers. You see the same problem with the shortage of doctors and nurses in Quebec, with long waiting lists to get an operation. A shortage is the unintended consequence of any price ceiling. Take notes. Let's see how we can show a price ceiling on a diagram. If you remember in our example, we had the price of the drug was 100, but the government said, let's lower it so that everybody can afford it. So we're going to draw the drug market with the supply and demand for drugs. And before the government intervention, before the price ceiling, we have a market price of PE, which is the equilibrium price, without any restrictions. All right, and the quantity produced, the quantity consumed is QE. All right, the government comes in and says, hang on, that's too much. We have to make it more affordable. So we're going to force the price down to P1, and that is the price ceiling, which is binding. Now, this is kind of important. I want you not to be confused here. Binding means effective, an effective price ceiling. If the price ceiling, if they said that the price ceiling is $1,000, that would not be binding in the sense that that wouldn't change anything. It's selling for 100. When you say the price ceiling is very high, what you mean is that it cannot go higher. Well, it's not higher anyway, so it's not going to have any impact. A binding price ceiling is necessarily low because it is meant to protect the buyers. So binding price ceiling is when you push down the ceiling and say, hey, you cannot go above here. All right, so that's the idea here. Now, if you look at this purple line, it has two intersections here. We have these 2 points intersecting the supply and the demand curve. So the first one shows us the quantity supplied. It's the intersection of the supply curve with the price level. Remember the law of supply? It says that when the price is low, the quantity supplied, the quantity that the sellers are willing to offer will be low. All right. The second point is based on the law of demand. This is the intersection of the price with the demand curve. When the price is low, there will be many buyers, right? Because it's affordable, okay? So when you have the price ceiling, what you get is a shortage, right? Quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, and this is how you show a shortage on a diagram. So if you're told to show a shortage on a graph, it's as simple as this, all right? So the net result is that because of this government policy, there will be lower production, right? The production is left here, and lower consumption because there's only so many drugs available in the market, all right? So pause here, do a nice, neat, large diagram for yourself with full labeling. Take minimum wage as a price floor. Before any government restriction, the market price can be anywhere. Oh no, that's scary. Let's say it's gonna be $10. Then the government comes in and says, hang on, workers shouldn't be exploited, so they must be paid at least $15 an hour, which by the way is completely arbitrary. Why not 20? Why not 50? Who's to decide? And that's the problem with paternalism, no objective criterion. A couple of reminders here. Workers are the sellers of labor, and minimum wage is a lower bound on the price of labor. So the price is going to increase, but again, it's an artificial imposition top down. So what's going to be the incentives of the employers for the demanders of labor? And what happens to the number of people who are willing to offer their work? So fill in the blanks when you take notes and make sure they're complete. All you need to do is to use the law of demand and the law of supply. The net effect will be a surplus. And a surplus of labor means that many workers like to offer their service, but there aren't many employers to hire them. And that's called unemployment. That was cool. Oh, geez. Congratulations. Yeah, you got unemployment out of nowhere. So the idea is that the government coercion results in fewer jobs, which defeats its purpose. So this kid is kind of like, what have you done? Now here's the thing. If we are in the normative judgmental mode, we can point the finger at the evil employers and call them ruthless and inconsiderate. But if you look at it rationally and objectively, they're actually being very considerate. After all, they're a business, not a charity. They too are struggling to survive and make ends meet. They're simply responding to incentives in the most rational way. The problem is that the government has distorted the incentives by fixing the price. And the solution is very simple. Remove price controls. Because once the buyers and sellers are free to interact, price signals will sort out the shortages and surpluses. Take notes. Let's show a price floor on a diagram. In our example, we had an initial equilibrium price of $10 for the wage, and then the government wants to raise it. All right, so we're going to have the labor market, which looks like any other market. With supply and demand, we use W instead of the P, which is the same thing. This is the price of labor, same idea. Then the government comes in and says, hang on, this is too low. We want the workers to be paid more, so we're going to set a minimum wage, which is a price floor. All right. Now notice that the price floor is binding or effective when it is above the market equilibrium. If the government says that you cannot pay your workers more than less than $10, right? Well, okay, it's already $10, so we are following that. If they say that you cannot, the minimum is $1, it's already followed, so it's not binding. It is binding, it is effective when it is above the market equilibrium, right? That's the part which can be a little bit tricky, but if you think about the logic of it, it actually makes sense. A price floor that is binding is the one which is higher than what is already in the market, all right? Now, what we're gonna have is two intersections. The intersection of the price with the demand curve gives us the quantity demanded. And again, think of the law of demand. The demanders of labor are the employers. If they have to pay a high wage, some of them won't be able to afford those workers because the wage is too high. So the demand for workers is going to be low. This intersection with the supply gives us the amount of people who want to work, right? These are the suppliers of work. So there's going to be a lot of people who want to work. By the way, I'm using 3 here because we used 2 in the previous diagram. Otherwise, you can use any kind of subscript that you want. All right. So when you have the minimum wage, you get more supply than demand, which is called a surplus. So if you're told to show a surplus on a graph, that's how it looks. All right. So the government coercion results in fewer jobs because there are only so many people who want to hire, so many firms who want to hire, and higher prices. It's a higher cost of production, which also means higher living expenses for the families. All right. Congratulations. Notice that the intentions were really good. We wanted to help the workers. We wanted to help the poor, but we ended up creating a surplus of labor, which is unemployment, and raising the costs for the firms and for the consumers. All right. So I want to emphasize that a lot of times the intentions are good, but the results are awful. Pause here, do your diagram, and take some notes. Wow, that was cool. Minimum wage reduces the freedom of contract of workers. What if someone is content with $10 an hour? They can't be hired at that price legally, which creates an underground economy of people working for cash. Firms have to pay more in costs, which means the price of end products for consumers will rise. It's like a flow-through tax, and most consumers of what is made with minimum wage are the very poor who were supposed to be helped. What a mess. It's an additional hurdle which creates rigidity in the labor market. When there are not enough positions, the more privileged are likely to land them at the expense of others. The worker's service has a certain value based on their skills and productivity, but the employers are forced to pay a premium on top of that. So from their perspective, they're paying for nothing. They're not receiving any service for that additional pay. So they're going to retaliate and pass on the costs to the workers as much as they can. And they can do it because they have more bargaining power since there are so many applicants. So they can discriminate and pick and choose. And this hurts the most those who want and need to climb up, like racial minorities, single mothers, and immigrants. It's really devastating to see how all that good intention turns on its head so dramatically. It reduces the effectiveness of the system since it's no longer governed by productivity but by favoritism and power dynamics. Pause here and summarize it in one sentence. The victims of minimum wage are the most vulnerable people, those who need to accumulate human capital and gain work experience. In the US, the black unemployment rate, especially for teenagers, skyrocketed after the minimum wage laws of 1950s and 60s. That's how it defeats its purpose. Now, to be fair, minimum wage does have some benefits. There are those who keep their jobs and they're the ones who benefit from it. But something that's kind of important is to see who pushes for it the most. So the greatest proponents of that are labor unions, who are usually professionals and people who work above minimum wage. So what is their stake at this? Well, they get to have more bargaining power and they'll limit their competition this way. So it's really a pacifier. It's a distraction. It has political benefits and it's lobbied by powerful organizations whose voices are heard more as opposed to the victims. Take notes. A rival or rivalrous good is something that depletes with consumption, that can be used by only one person at a time. If it doesn't run out, it's non-rival. Remember the difference between goods and services? Goods are tangible versus intangible, physical versus non-physical. So goods in general are rival. Services can be either rival or non-rival. So for instance, attention is rival. You can pay attention to only this or that, whereas information is non-rival. If you use a mathematical formula, it doesn't reduce from others. Something is excludable if you can control who gets it, usually through a price or permit. If it's up for grabs to anyone, then it's non-excludable. So we're going to have a nice colorful table and we're going to have 4 types of goods. So these are the names for it. So a private good is both rival and excludable. Like what? Like food and clothes, like this stupid kid. The cake that he has, if he eats it, there is less available to others, right? And he can exclude others from getting it, right? The same goes with clothes. Non-rival would be like Netflix or concert. You can watch a movie on Netflix, but other people can also be watching it at the same time. It doesn't reduce from them, but you have to pay for it, so it is excludable. Common resources are also called common pool or common property, like fish in the ocean or trees in the forest. So this is before the kind of permit requirements. In general, the nature of the good is such that anybody can go and catch it or chop a tree, so it's non-excludable. But if anybody gets a fish or tree, then it's going to be less available to others, so it is rival. And then public goods, also known as collective goods. The classical example is a lighthouse, but you can also think of street lights. Anybody passing there gets to enjoy it, right? And you can't really make them pay for it, right? And it doesn't reduce, right? So since it doesn't reduce from other people's enjoyment, it's non-rival. And since you can't make people pay for it, it's non-excludable. Of course, people pay for it through taxation, but not directly. And then national defense is the sense of security. So most goods and services are rival and excludable. Most things are private goods. And that's where the market works pretty well. These other three could result in a market failure, which is when, which is when resources are not allocated efficiently because of the incentives being out of place. Now, something important here is, so what? If the market doesn't work, does it mean that we should get rid of it? If you have a bruise on your hand, would you chop it away or you put up with it? Remember, you must always ask, what is the alternative? Because the alternative may have its own bigger failure. Then what? Milton Friedman, my hero, said there is a smokestack on the back of every government program, which means government intervention also imposes a cost on third parties without compensation because it distorts the incentives and creates unintended consequences. So we don't want to be quick to jump to a conclusion very fast. So take good notes on this slide. Write down your own example of something rival and something non-rival, something excludable and something non-excludable, and also copy this table in your notes, but write your own examples of the 4 types of goods. So here's a useful practice. A road can be either congested or non-congested. Congestion, which is traffic, tells us whether it's rival or not. A road can also be either a toll road or a non-toll road. The toll determines excludability. So you have 4 types of roads for the 4 cells in your table. Good luck. You see someone jump over the metro gate and ride for free. Or you have a group project and there is always that one person who doesn't do anything and gets the group's grade. So pause here and write your own example of a free rider. That would be the market failure problem of non-excludability. As for non-rivalry, the problem is called the tragedy of the commons, like overfishing, overharvesting, overexploitation of any scarce resource, which results in extinction. And all this is rational. When something is open access but limited, then everyone has the incentive to go and grab it before the other guy comes. The solution is to have clear ownership laws because people take care of their private property while they may abuse public property since the burden is distributed among everyone. And again, that abuse is also rational. Who would build streetlights? You can't make profit on it. You can't stop people passing by to pay you. You can't go and say, yo, if you don't pay, you can't pass. That's not doable. So the government can finance that through taxation like the municipal taxes, or a more creative way is advertisement. So all the applications that you use for free, including Google search and online news, they're funded by ads. The Jazz Festival is another example. So pause here and write your own example of free rider, tragedy of commons, and government solution and market provision for public goods. Don't you hate how they release updated editions of textbooks every year, so you have to buy a new copy? In the long run, textbooks are non-rival. They can be passed on to the next cohort, but the publisher doesn't make money on the used book sale. So new editions are a way of making them rival, almost like an expiry date. Knowledge by nature is non-rival and non-excludable. That's why scientific discoveries are patented and artistic compositions are copyrighted to limit their access. Now you might be like, hang on, why do they do that? The economic explanation for it is to incentivize innovation. Because why on earth should a pharmaceutical firm invest so much on R&D, which is research and development, if they can't make profit off it? If it can easily be copied by others who free ride on them. So it can induce more economic growth. But the catch is, now the firms put their resources into the bureaucratic maze, which is not efficient. Notice that the new edition is bottom-up, whereas patent is top-down. At the core of the environmental issue is a lack of precise property rights. And that shows where we need to work on. To the extent that the owner of a resource can be clearly defined, it will not be abused. Take notes. To recap, a market failure is when the market outcome is not ideal, it's not efficient, either because too much is produced, like overfishing, clear cutting, and pollution, or too little is produced, like roads and parks and security. Now the question is, what do we do? When the market doesn't work, what is the answer? What is the solution? One solution that is often proposed is government. Let the government take care of it, all right? But we have to be careful. When something doesn't work, we have to ask, what is the available alternative? And is the alternative really better? Because the thing is, the government has its own problems, right? So one of the problems of the government is that how can the government know how much is the right amount? They don't have the proper information. And that's called the economic calculation problem, which was proposed by Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. It's pretty clever in terms of why socialism didn't work. It's because the government didn't know how much to produce and at what price. So another question is, at what expense? even if the government solution works, maybe we are making a greater sacrifice, right? So for instance, we have to think about what are the other costs on the public because of that, including liberty, including the taxes, and including the grounds for favoritism because of lobbying, right? So all of these are the pollutions made by the government, all right? So, and that is called the government failure. So there's market failure, and there's also government failure due to the nature of how the government works. So pause here. The gist of it is that the market has its own limitations. The government also has its own limitations, right? So neither is perfect. There is no ideal. So let's get it over with being perfectionist. There is no perfect solution. And we have to really sit down and see in which case do we make the most of it? What are the sacrifices we are willing to make? All right. There is a nice quote by Thomas Sowell, a brilliant economist. The fact that the market is not doing what we wish it would do is no reason to automatically assume that the government would do better, right? That's the whole sensitivity of economics. Why is that? Because the welfare state is not really about the welfare of the masses, it is about the egos of the elite, right? So that's really what's going on. So yeah, the market is driven by self-interest, but the government is also driven by self-interest. There are equally self-interested people who are making decisions, right? So what we want to do is we want to try to decentralize power as much as possible, because when the power is concentrated, there is a problem, and easily it can be abused and cause corruption. There is an inherent coercion in any government policy, because if you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. If you don't follow the rules, you go to jail. So whenever we bring in the government, we are bringing in force. Like, that's the nature of government, and we have to be very careful. If we care about liberty, we have to be very careful not to propose government solutions right away. Thomas Sowell is an amazing economist who's really old now. He has a lot of good books. I recommend you reading them. Wow, that was cool. Now you might be like, hang on. So what should the government do? The government should do things that only the government can do. All right, such as what? A main part of that is things related to security and law, right? So the police, the army, the courts, all right? Let me emphasize this property rights here is super important. We need to have clear property rights which are protected. If you don't have the assurance that what you earn will be yours, it really kills the incentives for productivity. And here you can also see why taxes, especially income taxes and corporate taxes, these can be so destructive since they disincentivize productivity. Another role of the government is basic infrastructure, right? Having those things which really facilitate and serve everybody, all right? And you can here see that, look at how much the government is meeting these things. Like, look at the condition of the roads and the condition of the crime and things like that. It seems that the government has been distracted. Its main role has been these things. It's not really fulfilling these things, and it's doing a whole bunch of other things which it doesn't really have to do. We can have market solutions for the other things where the government is concentrating on. Basically, all of these things refer to the incentive to plan and prosper, right? So we need to have the government in a way that doesn't kill the incentives. We need a government to limit the government. We need a government which can hold back and not interfere too much. The government's role is to limit its own role. Pause here. Wow, that was cool. The environmentalist concern is that our growing levels of production and consumption can't be sustained by the Earth's scarce resources. This is a rhetoric which has been running for centuries. Ehrlich and Suzuki have said it repeatedly. I've just given you a couple of dates. And these are scientists with a lot of credibility. But this is a forecast that's been proven wrong every time. And we're going to see why. For more than 2 centuries, scientists have been predicting the doom of humankind, and even going so far as proposing a sterilization of the population. Now, to be fair, they got one thing right, that the environment is a common resource, and it's a scarce one. That was cool. What's so interesting is that the people in this camp, the apocalyptic prophets, never learn from their mistake. They always say, this time it's different. We are heading for imminent crisis and the world is coming to an end. Sorry, it is not different this time either, because you did not understand one thing, that humans are dynamic. Here's a process which explains why these predictions have always come out wrong. The market price is a measure of scarcity, and changes in market price affect the incentives of buyers, sellers, and potential entrepreneurs. And all these market forces work to resolve any scarcity issue in a very natural, bottom-up way. I want to emphasize two elements in this process here. The price of all natural resources have fallen over the past 100 years. Why? Because their proved resources have increased. Now we have far more above our consumption levels. We are nowhere close to scarcity. There are absolutely no grounds for the environmental panic that you hear commonly. These rhetorics only serve political interests, as we shall see. So climate change is a reality, and it has always been there. But calling it a crisis is a fallacy and does not stand to evidence. So take notes on these, especially the process here. Make sure you understand the market mechanism. There are two types of price controls, where the price ceiling tends to lead to a shortage and a price floor would lead to a surplus. And these are examples of government failure, which are based on the economic calculation problem. There are also a few causes for a market failure, and examples of that would be free riding and tragedy of commons. Both market failure and government failure lead to inefficiency. In today's lesson, what I would emphasize is the concept of externality as well as the economic calculation problem. So try to be able to link these together and why the price controls are an example of economic calculation problem. So pause here, do your own concept map. Try to see if you can add some concepts that we didn't include, like we talked about common resources, club goods, all of those things, so that it can be more of your own added value. Look at what you learned from today's lesson and try to augment the answer that you initially gave to today's myth. In terms of counterexamples, we can look at post-war Germany, where they had caps on food and it was a total mess. Universal healthcare in Canada is something that is equally unavailable to everyone. One of my former students called it universal hellcare, H-E-L-L. Oh no. In terms of arguments, basically price ceilings create a shortage, and there is no such thing as free lunch. We do pay for what is quote-unquote free through other ways. And there's going to be black markets with their own problems, and these kinds of policies end up defeating their own purpose. Have a good day.